So anyways, let me run through some things that I prepared for you all to mentally, cognitively chew on. So if you're joining us on YouTube after the fact instead of live on the date, January 24th, please ring the bell, as the YouTubers say, so that you'll get notices of our uploads. Thank you very much, John Goche, for doing those uploads. And look at some of the other things we have here. Go to our website and get on our email list so that you'll get notices of these meetings. And also when we eventually, I hope, resume some in-person events as well. So I have some remarks today on the idea of if-then. We're always talking about thought and thinking and saying that that's our religion. But on the other hand, we don't often go into very much detail. We have gone into a lot of detail over the years, but I want to go into more detail about one of the ways of considering this today. If I can advance the slide. There we go. So let's just start off and realize that our perceptions are all we have. What we see, what we hear, we smell, taste, touch, all the other information coming in through our senses, of which there's than just a traditional five, of course. We could delve into that at some time. But it's really a fact that we consist of, we're really made of our perceptions. We let our visual systems, for example, depend on seeing things, having the visual stimulation from the time we were born and we're babies. And if you take animals and you cover their eyes, after a certain period of time, they will be blind lifelong. So our visual brains, the visual cortices depend on that visual stimulation. So in a very real sense, we're made of our perceptions, and knowledge and truth represent our guesses at how to organize, how to relate our perceptions. And again, thinking about the visual system, that kind of happened automatically. And our brains kind of make sense of that based on our evolutionary heritage. Then, of course, the next step is we test these conjectures. We put our knowledge and truth to the test and see how well it works. And one of the most productive things we can do is to look for ways in which our organization of our perceptions fails. That's why optical illusions are so interesting, is because they're examples of how our visual systems make sense of things, but then not always very perfectly. So since we consist of and are made of our perceptions and the knowledge and truth that we build from them, this is very important. We improve ourselves when we replace our knowledge and truth with better ones, when we uncover visual illusions, for example, but also cognitive illusions. There are all sorts of things along those lines that we know of. Since there are innumerable ways to organize or make sense of our perception, there are also then innumerable versions of knowledge and truth. And the question then becomes how to choose among them. Well, obviously, by recourse to our perceptions. And then this whole business of critical discussion, coming up against each other. What do you think about this? What about that? We can't do it all on our own, or at least we can do it much better together by people who are really interested. It's not like you can do it with voting. That's silly, but it's really helpful when other people help us critically examine what it is we think is the truth. One common way of thinking is to say, if something is the case, then we should expect something else or not expect something else. And we can think of many examples of this. Certainly someone once upon a time thought, well, if apples falling off of a tree behave the same way that the moon, the sun, and the planets do, then we get what? We get Newton's laws of motion. And that turned out to be the case. Or if a later physicist thought, if light travels at the same speed regardless of your standpoint, which seemed to be the case from experimental data, then here are all the consequences of that we should expect to see, including displacement of stars close to the sun during a total solar eclipse. And that was, of course, one of the proofs of Einsteinian relativity. There's all sorts of things, and in our private lives. If someone is, if my partner is cheating on, then what? You would expect to find or not find certain things in your relationship or what's going on with them. Or if your child is doing very well in school, then you should expect to see this and not expect to see that. So this is just a common way of reasoning, even if you don't explicitly recognize it. As we go along, I invite you to try to explicitly recognize when it's going on. Now, it often happens we say, well, if something is the case, then we should expect something or not expect something else, but then we're surprised. And so then we back off of that, but we don't go back and say, well, X is wrong. We say, oh, well, X is the case, but unless A, or except if B, but if C, or maybe D. And as long as these provisos and qualifications and modifications aren't too unwieldy and too complex, we're not totally dissatisfied with. But if it gets to be too complex, too many of them, it gets to be too woolly and basically destroys the whole idea of what your X was to begin with, then you got a problem. Certainly that happened with astrology. People sometimes say, oh, well, it seems to work here, or even geocentrism, the idea that everything was revolving around the earth. They made that work for an awful long time by inserting all these additional epicycles and their modifications to the theory. So much so that when Copernicus came along and people started saying, maybe everything goes around the sun, oh my, there were the pushback, not just because of the Bible, but because they'd already worked out all these ways of making sense of those things. They didn't see the point of switching to something entirely new, even though it was better and simpler. Of course, anything could be the case, but we have to be clear about the anything we're talking about. We have to have in mind how it relates and connects to our perceptions. And that is actually what we mean by talking about natural explanations. That is explanation. If we go outside of connecting things coherently, understandably to our perceptions, then we're basically getting into anything goes kind of, which works great for people who want to believe what I want it to believe, but not so great for the rest of us that want things to hang together. This is a great cartoon. I remember seeing it when it first came out many years ago, and it just is a great example of how gods and supernaturalism is stuck into things. We often recognize that now, called the God of the gaps. So here's somebody who's trying to explain their theory to someone else, and the someone else saying, I think you need to be a little bit more explicit here, because otherwise there's no way to connect the equations on the left with equations on the right. The problem is too that supernaturalism really has no explanatory power. When anything goes, then how can you even trust all of your experimental data? If someone can, power of their mind or through prayer or any other means, cause something to happen that otherwise wouldn't, you trust any kind of scientific experimentation. Somebody in the lab is making it happen or praying for it to happen a certain way. It's not going to be reliable. Robert Green Ingersoll, wonderful, famous guy in the 19th century, pointed out, our ignorance is God. What we know is science. And when God is used to explain something, therefore, we can be sure that it's just that someone could think of no better explanation, which is the case. I mean, we're just puzzled by many things. And that's not a problem, it's just a puzzle, a problem that we're presented with. It's, as we said last time, it's kind of nice not to know everything, because it means that we still have room to learn, to grow and discover, and to make what we already know better. Leo Era, never heard of this guy before, found this quote on the internet. He was a Belgian botanist, and he pointed out that God is the veil under which we hide our ignorance of causes. In other words, God is an explanation. It's a pretense of understanding and knowledge. Most of us have heard of William of Ockham. Spelling was not standardized in those days, so sometimes it's spelled O-C-K-H-A-M. Seen it that way, probably other ways. And he said in Latin, "Entia non sunt applicanda praeter necessitem," meaning Entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. Remember the qualifications and provisos, all of those things. You can't have too many of them. If you have a few that you really need, that makes sense, fine. Or as Einstein put it, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And if you think about it, that is really what we mean by knowledge. A map is a simplification of whatever it is you're mapping. If it's the thing itself, it's not simpler, it's not knowledge. So really, that's what knowledge and truth is. It's simplification, generalizations. So this is the if-then, and I want to show you a wonderful example of if-then reasoning. This has to do with, actually, I believe the entire exchange is online, where Sean Carroll, a physicist from Caltech, in fact, I believe he occupies the chair once held by Richard Feynman, is debating William Lane Craig on, of course, William Lane Craig is a Christian apologist who wants to explain everything with his God. And Sean Carroll just does an excellent job of just dismantling the things that William Lane Craig says. So I need to, I think, unshare here and then move to a different screen. So stop share.
Fifth, and most importantly, theism fails as an explanation. Even if you think the universe is finely tuned and you don't think that naturalism can solve it, theism certainly does not solve it. If you thought it did, if you played the game honestly, what you would say is, here is the universe that I expect to exist under theism. I will compare it to the data and see if it fits. What kind of universe would we expect? And I claim that over and over again, the universe we expect matches the predictions of naturalism, not theism. So the amount of tuning, if you thought that the physical parameters of our universe were tuned in order to allow life to exist, you would expect enough tuning but not too much. Under naturalism, a physical mechanism could far over-tune by an incredibly large amount that has nothing to do with the existence of life, and that is exactly what we observe. For example, the entropy of the early universe is much, 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 much lower than it needs to be to allow for life. You would expect under theism that the particles and parameters of particle physics would be enough to allow life to exist and have some structure that was designed for some reason, whereas under naturalism you'd expect them to be kind of random and a mess. Guess what? They are kind of random and a mess. You would expect under theism life to play a special role in the universe. Under naturalism you'd expect life to be very insignificant. I hope I don't need to tell you, life is very insignificant as far as the universe is concerned. Here is a photograph from the Hubble Space Telescope of a few hundred out of the hundreds of billions of galaxies in our observable universe. The theistic explanation for cosmological fine-tuning asks you to look at this picture and say, I know why it's like that. It's because I was going to be here, or we were going to be here. But there is nothing in our experience of the universe that justifies the kind of flattering story we like to tell about ourselves. In fact, I would argue that the failure of theism to explain the fine-tuning of the universe is paradigmatic. It helps understand the other ways in which theism fails to be a better theory than naturalism. What you should be doing over and over again is comparing the predictions or expectations under theism to under naturalism. You find that over and over again naturalism wins. And I'm going to zoom through these. It's not the individual arguments that are important, it's the accumulated effect. If theism were really true, there's no reason for God to be hard to find. He should be perfectly obvious, whereas in naturalism you might expect people believe in God, but the evidence to be thin on the ground. Under theism, you'd expect that religious beliefs should be universal. There's no reason for God to give special messages to this or that primitive tribe thousands of years ago. Why not give it to anyone? Whereas under naturalism, you'd expect different religious beliefs inconsistent with each other to grow up under different local conditions. Under theism, you'd expect religious doctrines to last a long time in a stable way. Under naturalism, you'd expect them to adapt to social conditions. Under theism, you'd expect the moral teachings of religion to be transcendent, progressive, sexism is wrong, slavery is wrong. Under naturalism, you'd expect that they reflect, once again, local mores, sometimes good rules, sometimes not so good. You'd expect the sacred texts under theism to give us interesting information. Tell us about the germ theory of disease. Tell us to wash our hands before we have dinner. Under naturalism, you'd expect that sacred text to be a mishmash, some really good parts, some poetic parts, and some boring parts and mythological parts. Under theism, you'd expect biological forms to be designed. Under naturalism, they would derive from the twists and turns of evolutionary history. Under theism, minds should be independent of bodies. Under naturalism, your personality should change if you're injured, tired, or you haven't had your cup of coffee yet. Under theism, you'd expect that maybe you can explain the problem of evil. God wants us to have free will, but there shouldn't be random suffering in the universe. Life should be essentially just. And at the end of the day, in theism, you basically expect the universe to be perfect. Under naturalism, it should be kind of a mess. This is very strong empirical evidence. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but I can explain all of that. I know you can explain all. So can I. It's not hard to come up with ex post facto justifications for why God would have done it that way. Why is it not hard? Because theism is not well defined. That's what computer scientists call a bug, not a feature.
Anyway, very often the best answer is, and I think the physicists are very much into this, kinds of puzzles in physics, because it's a fundamental truth of existence. We frequently say, we don't know something. And to say, I don't know yet, at least, is a very good thing. And there are some things that we even think, this is something we can never know. But then again, in order to know many things, we have to have the instrumentation or the outlook, the perspective to figure out. And there's lots of things we figured out now that we never thought we would figure out. But a new instrument, a new way of looking at things. I mean, how would we ever know what's going on the skies above us without telescopes? And of course, we didn't have telescopes for a long time. And so let's just run through a few things. And January 20th, turns out it was a sort of interesting date in history. First of all, 1712, the birthday of Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia. There's even a place out in New Jersey or someplace called Frederick, King of Prussia. So the thing of it, and the reason why he's into people, he was a friend to Voltaire, the famous freethinker. Frederick the Great himself, probably a deist. There's not a lot of reason to think he was an outright atheist, but then many people were not that long ago. The other thing about Frederick the Great, they say, is he might have been gay. He was. On this date in 1848, the 49ers gold started in California. That was the date that gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill. Very interesting story behind that, and all the people that were rich from the California gold rush, them not involved in finding and selling gold at all, but in supplying the miners. Somebody had to sell them the shovels and so on and so forth. Let's head to the 20th century. In 1947, Michio Kaku was born. He's another physicist, wonderful guy whose main area of research has been in string theory, and there's many interesting talks that he's given on YouTube. 1961, there was 52 carrying a couple of H-bombs that crashed in North Carolina near the town of Goldsboro. Sometimes you see the date as being January 23rd, and that's because it happened late at night. So it happened late at night, 23rd, early in the morning, 24th. They did recover one of the bombs, which when it parachutes to Earth, the chute got stuck in a tree and was found upright on the ground. The other H-bomb hit the ground, fortunately did not detonate, and went down about 10 or 20 feet. And currently they think it's as deep as 180 to 200 feet in this kind of soft, muddy ground where it went down. There's really interesting things online, including declassified documents showing that the arming mechanisms were armed like 3 out of 4. So there was only fail-safe that had failed. You might have got a nuclear explosion. You might not have got the nuclear, the thermonuclear, but certainly the conventional explosives could have set off the atomic explosive. Had one of these bombs gone off, it's obviously would have been a major disaster. I think that the kill radius estimated at about 8 miles. Everything in 8 miles radius would have been destroyed, killed. Then an even potentially even worse disaster in 1978, the Soviet Cosmos 954 reconnaissance satellite re-entered over Canada's West Territories. Now, the thing of it is, this reconnaissance satellite had a nuclear reactor aboard. That's what was its source of power. It contained 50 kilogram of uranium-235. So when this thing came down over Canada, the Americans and the Canadians got together and went searching for pieces of this stuff. They only find about 1%. Many pieces were radioactive, and one was radioactive enough to where if somebody had collected it or found it later and was in close proximity, in their car or something was nearby, it'd take but a few hours for them to get a lethal dose of radiation. There had already been a convention treaty in place that made countries responsible for damage caused by their crashing spacecraft, and the bill initially was about $6 million. The Soviets only wound up paying about $3 million of that. There's a very interesting item that you can find online. It's linked to from the Wikipedia entry on the Cosmos 954, which talks about the people who did the planning. Actually, it's written by one of the people involved in the planning of what to do about this. They knew it was going to come down. They weren't aware which countries should they contact and say, you might get this nuclear reactor falling on you and so forth, and how they wrestled with how to deal with the Soviets. They were asking the Soviets some questions about what they could expect and technical questions about the satellite that would help in recovering pieces of it or understanding what might happen and were it to come down for a populated area. And when you call a document, it's in the Wayback Machine on the internet. It's interesting because it's stamped. So if you want to read an example of something that formerly classified secret, that's the thing to look. It's written in a very folksy manner too, I thought. Interestingly enough, this Cosmos series, the Soviets had a bunch of those that they put up, and two other ones that we know of came down. As one came down in the Northwest Pacific, some ways north of Japan, and another one crashed in the South Atlantic. Both of those had the nuclear reactors on board too. So the Soviet Union didn't turn out to be a very good response party, but it would be very interesting to know what your documents on their end said, or even what was told publicly about these things. I mean, somebody's head rolled perhaps, but maybe the story was that the capitalist imperialists had sabotaged their reconnaissance satellites. Who knows? So it'd be an interesting story behind these things. 1984, how many people bought Macintosh? That's when the thing began sale. And in 2003, of course, not long after the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security began operation. So just to look back at things that happened, some in memory and some not. Just to quickly review our principles, since we are a church, we have a creed. You believe this or you're going to heck. Reason it, live by it as best you can. We're not excommunicate you if you don't do the greatest job on it. This is the kind of commitment we all have. We certainly put this first, to try to live our lives reason. And we want to also use reason as a way of enjoying life and each other, of what we have, and appreciating this one life that we have, not to be hankering after some additional life afterwards, which, I don't know, sitting on a cloud playing a harp forever doesn't sound very appealing anyway. But most of all, and to forget that love, value, meaning, and purpose, finding these things, and any kind of value, meaning, or purpose that would be set for us by something else, even an omnipotent sky papa deity, is not going to be something that we can necessarily love. Even actors and actresses, they may like the plays that they're in, but it's not their idea usually. And then got some different things to say here about political discussion. Of course, sex and religion, we want to talk all we can about that. Here's the problem with politics, is that it tends to destroy civility. Here's a good cartoon illustrating that idea. And this is so interesting, I thought, that both major parties and the American population as a whole, I don't think these numbers are very different. I think it's about 70% right across the board that agree that the nation has a civility problem. And in fact, I wonder about that roughly 25 to 30% of people that think we don't have a major problem with civility in this country. And most people also think that the tone and civility of U.S. debate is getting worse by far. Just if a candidate for any office got 60% of the vote, and 68% of the people said it's getting worse, then maybe we really do have a problem. So what do we do about it? Well, you can find this on 15 principles of civility. Now, hold on, there's only 8 up here. There's another slide that's got the other 7, but you can really spend a lot of time thinking about each one of these things, paying attention, for example, to other people and what they're saying. And it just doesn't looking at them while you're thinking of what you're going to say in response, but actually pay attention to what they're saying and listening and trying to understand what they're trying to communicate. Speaking kindly and assuming the best. And I think we atheists, sometimes we have a problem with that because, and the believers have, if anything, should be better at it than us because after all, they read their Bible book and they assume the word of God. And so all the crazy things that are in there, they're be ready and able to come to any number of ad hoc ex post facto excuses for why some crazy thing in the Bible is really a good thing. And I don't necessarily agree with respecting others' opinions, but respect the others. They have opinions. They're entitled to their opinions the same as you. Try to understand their point of view. And being inclusive, I think we do a good job of that. We're often say, oh, so-and-so has their hand up, let them have something to say, and acknowledging others and respecting other people's time and space. And I'm sorry that the video didn't do a very good job of that today because we had this feedback problem and all of that. But search up that debate between William Lane Craig and Sean Carroll. Other things by Sean Carroll too, very interesting stuff he is. And here's the last 7 principles of civility. To apologize when you have reason to apologize, make a big deal of it. Don't just say, oh, well, sorry about that. Do assert yourself. You want to be heard, but also accept and give praise. Take responsibility, accept constructive criticism, and you may consider how you do that, probably third person. I do that a lot, many times, because as we talked about before the video, before we started the video here, that in my day job, I frequently encounter people who have very wrong ideas about things, and it really helps to just in the face and say, you're wrong. But it can be helpful to, well, hear what some other people say. Let's consider another point of view besides what you're saying. Do refrain from idle complaints and be considerate, and consider that there are always gaps where other people are concerned. Here's an interesting slide showing perhaps why it's so difficult. The figure top left is from 1994. I have not looked up the original research study on this. Somehow they calculated where the centers of gravity were for political ideology, and they find that in 14 that the center may be the same. The axes of the 2 major political parties have shifted quite a lot. The purple, of course, shows the common ground, and it looks like the common ground has shifted still quite a lot. And I think this is an assumption that we should make always, that is common ground, and then let's find it. And remember, as Edison said, when you think you've considered all the possibilities of what the common ground may be, you haven't. You've missed things. But we always are missing things. This probably factors into the public trust in government. Can you believe back in the 1960s that it was 70 to 80%? And now we're down at less than 20%. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe a bad thing, but maybe this is for common ground. If so many of us do not have much trust in government, then that's something that we can build on for common ground. Epictetus, another guy worth reading, he said it's impossible for someone to learn what they already know. And Abraham Lincoln, who actually said that he would destroy his enemies by making them friends, said, I don't like that man. I must get to know him better. The idea being, of course, that if there's someone you don't like, maybe you just don't know enough about them to know what you like about them. There's something to be liked in everyone. If you don't have that attitude, then I'm sorry, but it's better to live with that there's redeeming qualities in everybody, even though you don't like. And Walter Lippmann, a famous thinker, pundit of the 20th century, made this very excellent point. Everybody thinks alike, no one thinks very much. This is another quote from Jonathan Haidt, who wrote that book I mentioned previously called Righteous Mind. And he points out that democracy is hard. It demands teamwork, compromise, something a lot of us really hate to do. But even the most crazy things that he says, if people can make sense of the Bible by, there must be some way that this can make sense, then I think that we can effort to do that too. Also, especially having respect for rules, too bad, because we all know people that don't have respect for rules, but a willingness to engage with other opinionated, vociferous individuals. And of course, he points out it demands practice. The more you do something, the better you get at it. That's actually from a piece in the New York Times, was from 2018. After reading, I thought this is a good little clip here. Finally, Freethought is not free. Please go to our website and visit, look at all the things that are there, and donate through the PayPal link. We do depend on your continued support. Primary support is being, participating in conversation and helping us get somewhere in terms of understanding the world ourselves. And as I always say, the reasons to give us your money boil down to one thing, that we're doing together what none of us can do on our own. And I don't want any of you darned to heck. That would be terrible. Think of the uncomfortable warmth that you would have if you were darned to heck. Help us promote views, and all of us should demonstrate our commitment and be the future that we wish to see. With that, we'll to question and answer discussion. And again, if you're watching on YouTube, please go to our Facebook page, like us there, ring the bell, etc., and come back in the future and see what else we've got posted. Thank you so much, everyone.